Good evening, good morning, good day, whenever you tune in. I always say that, don't I? But this is Preston Smith with the three things, courtesy of The Corners, which you can find at www.thecorners.pl, and CDDI, because I hope, or one day maybe, I will be your detective and intelligence investigator in Central Europe. And you can find out more about that at www.cddi.pl. And we are coming to you from MRP Studios in Praga. And I know the first question is, where you been? Well, hey guys, I got sick. It happens. Flu season, it's raining, it's getting cold. We had Halloween, whatever. It wasn't that great a Halloween for me, but whatever. But also, on the upside or the downside, depending how you look at things, we have a new magazine out and up. So if you go to www.thecorners.pl, you will see this, or it might be on this side, depending where Evgeny, our genius studio producer, puts it. But yeah, we have a whole new magazine. If you hit the site and you hit the title, where it says Octopus, it will open up. You can scroll through it. You can even download it, read it to your heart's content. And there is a lot of grime and crime. Remember, I kept hinting that we were going to talk about the narco bosses and the mafia all through the Balkans and how it's all intertwined from Montenegro to Serbia. Well, hey, I go through all that in this edition. And I tell you the truth, it's freaking complicated. And even I mean, I know it, I understand it, I figured it out, I talked to plenty of people to write that, but hey, and because it's so complicated, I actually realized that there's a few things I should have put into the mag that I didn't get into the mag, which will lead into the three things we're going to talk about today, which will include the Sky ECC encryption company that closed, that revealed a billion emails, extradition in our region and to our region. How does that really work? And why is it so controversial? And why does it actually piss me off? Well, I'll tell you. And finally, yes, the Ukrainian war update. It's been a tough few weeks for Ukraine, for the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, and the outlook is tough. We're going to talk about that. But before we get into the three things, this is kind of like a lead-in, a prelude to the first thing. I want to talk about a couple things that we did not bring up, that I didn't manage to get into the magazine. Well, actually, I think I did manage to get this into the magazine, but you'll find out if you read it. My mind's kind of mush now. I don't even know if I remember. But one thing happened, which was expected, was that down in Serbia, President Alexander Vučić, he said, that's it, we're going to have early elections, snap elections on December 17th. He's dissolving parliament. Things are going to get weird down there. You can read a bit of the background and expect more to be forthcoming. There's all kinds of twists down there. I tell you, that's yeah. I'm not going to get into that because we talked about Kosovo, we talked about Banjska, the raid, the EU pressure, the US pressure, the opposition, whatever. I mean, if you go back and watch a couple of the last episodes, maybe you already did because you missed me over the last week. But the other thing that I didn't put in, and this actually is interesting, and it should have gone into the cover story. It just, frankly, kind of, I had a bit of a brain fart. But a few weeks ago, only a few weeks ago, 16 suspects were arrested. They were trafficking cocaine from Brazil to Europe. And you go, oh man, you're cocaine again. Yes, cocaine. Now, what is interesting here is that the guys that were nabbed, now actually when Europol released this information, they didn't say who it was. But the local press and some of the international press, and I can't remember if it was Radio Free Europe or Voice of America, or maybe it was the Organized Crime and Corruption Project, whatever. But they said that one was Alexander N., who was the head of this smuggling gang, who was the son of Goran N. Yes, I'm only using initials for last names because I'm not insane. That actually Alexander was the boss. Now, why I'm mentioning his dad, Goran, who's been in jail since like 2011 for cocaine trafficking, is because these guys were tied to something that was called Group America, which was they were actually supposedly recruited by a guy named Darko S. We'll just leave his initial for now. Darko S., the kingpin, the founder, the be-all and end-all, kind of a legend, this guy who's behind kind of big-time cocaine smuggling, allegedly. When his gang disintegrated, it split they're all out of Kotor in Montenegro. It split into the Skaljaris and the Kavaches, and they went to war, but then still the cocaine production ramped up, et cetera, et cetera. Now, this leads into the first thing, because as you will find out in the cover story, that Darko S is still on trial, and there has been some debate about whether or not to use the busted encryption mails that basically incriminate all kinds of people throughout the Balkans, for everything from murder to corruption. You got politicians tied to, et cetera, et cetera. Now, recently, as is also in the cover story, in Serbia, where actually Darko S is being tried, and not only, they ruled, yeah, this stuff is admissible. But let's backtrack on that and get into the first thing, because what I actually didn't do in the cover story is tell you a whole lot about this Sky ECC, or the ECC Sky encryption system. So I want to do that in the first thing and talk a little bit about this admissibility and what it's going to mean and what has happened throughout Europe since this encryption system basically got busted, got broken by the authorities. So that's enough of a very long introduction. Let's get on to the first thing. Now, the first thing, the Sky ECC encryption system that was busted and has led to the arrests of drug traffickers everywhere, almost everywhere, or quite a few of them. Now, before I get into this, actually, you know what, before I'm getting into this, like and subscribe, be a friend, be cool. We've got a lot of subscribers. How many subscribers do we have now, Evgeny? 2,100 subscribers. 2,100 degenerates like me that are into crime and grime, and I'm not really calling you a degenerate. I'm saying maybe I'm a degenerate, but not you. But like and subscribe, and there will be more to come. Now, back to what I was talking about. If you get into encryption systems, these have actually, for years and years and years, especially in Europe, been controversial. One, because they're so good. Now, what did they come out of? To tell you the truth, they kind of came out of the mobile phone industry to begin with. And I don't mean, yes, apps for mobile phones. I'm talking about mobile phones in general. Because for years, I'll tell you actually a couple of true story. I'm going to tell you a few true stories this episode. When mobile phones became popular, and I remember being in Eastern Europe in the 90s, the late 90s, suddenly, you know, the cool cats, actually a lot of mafia guys, they had black Mercedes and they had mobile phones, sometimes great big, almost walkie-talkie mobile phones. And then it became Nokia. And then after Nokia, then of course there were the other brands and all that, but then there was BlackBerry, like the brick. And people were like, oh, nobody can break into BlackBerry. And then you know, later on, it turned out that in some parts of the world, when, for example, like the iPhone showed up and all that, I remember people saying, oh, I only want to use Nokia because the Americans are listening to everything else. It's like, well, you think those little Nokias are safe? But I tell you, another true story is that at the time, you would go to certain meetings, and literally I saw this, that everybody'd say, okay, phone's on the table, right? And so everybody'd have to take their phones, they'd take their batteries out, and they'd put them on the table, and then you would talk. And even when I was years and years ago, when I was an investigative journalist, that's what you would do. And then I'd talk to a cop, and I believe him. I think this is true because people kind of tend to bash on the Central European cops and all that. But the smart ones, and sometimes they had budgets and they had a lot of help. And he was telling me that there was, what they came up with was like a tiny bug that they would tape to the batteries. And so the bug was actually taped to the battery and would be fueled by the batteries. So these guys would take their phones out, put them away, and put the batteries on the table and just I don't know if it was true or not, but I kind of believe it because of some of the other things that I have seen moving forward in Central Europe. And in fact, there was a time where there were so many bugs, and a lot of them were very advanced. We did a job when there was a bug that because I work with guys that have bug scanning equipment, and they found a bug that was on the roof, and what it was doing, it was taking photos, it was on the ceiling, taking photos of this guy's desk, and they couldn't understand why they were losing all their tenders. Well, they were losing all their tenders because the bug would take photos of their offers while they would write them on the computer, then print them out because the guy was old school and read them. And the bug was taking pictures and sending the actual information to the competitor who would just win these tenders by just a nudge every single time. And that bug was probably at the time worth about 60,000 euros, something like that, because actually the way it worked, I know I'm totally off the subject already, but actually the way it worked was it would only come on when it sensed movement or activity in the room. And then it was literally not on, it didn't have a signal. So they had done a bug scan, not with very good equipment, that just didn't pick it up. Then we did the bug scan and we picked it up because we are better than everybody else. But now, let's get back to what we're talking about. After the mobile phones, and everyone was worried about people listening in onto mobile phones, then you started having gradually, oh no, somebody's sending a virus maybe to my computer. The key counting viruses are the viruses that would hit your computer and they would see all your keys, take photographs of your computer, and then you started getting everyone's listening to my phones. Now, to tell you the truth, people would say, oh, I got to buy this phone or that phone, and then my phone can't be infected and no one will know what I'm doing. That was kind of not true, for example, in Poland, because what the services were doing here was they would basically use a warrant, and this is more of late than back then, but they would use a warrant and they would make the actual phone company listen in to what you were doing and see your SMSs and all that so you could have a bug or not. But if it was encrypted to a certain level, well, then everything's off the table. And that's where we got into different services that were like Sky Global, Sky ECC. Now, Sky ECC, to give you just a little bit of background, and since I am probably a genius, but I didn't memorize this yet. But this was founded in 2008 in Vancouver, Canada. It basically wound up defeating all of the police in Europe, the US, no one could actually get into this, break these codes. The name of the CEO is a guy named Jean-Francois E. I'll just leave it at that. And this went on until about March 2021, which basically corresponded roughly, that was about a year later or so, than when suddenly the authorities, they managed to break into the, allegedly, I lied to you. Belgian and Dutch authorities were able to access the network, I can't speak today, from February 15th, 2021, okay? And then they conducted raids all over Europe. They started busting people, but supposedly they intercepted about 1 billion messages, 1 billion, and about half of those have already, probably even more now, have already been read. Now, why was this important? Because this app, and I actually believe the founder when he said, look, we created this basically to allow people privacy. The government couldn't just snoop. They couldn't just read everything you were doing, and we're going to come back to that in a minute because he's got a point. However, it was grossly misused, which is certainly true, because what we know, especially from the European authorities, they've actually been pretty open about this, that they've seen so much activity, not just transactions, when it came to cocaine deals, when it came to, yeah, we want you to go kill some guy, organizing mafia hits, but actually you found, coming out of Holland, supposedly out of Serbia, photos taken of, or films of people being tortured, supposedly dismembered, horrible stuff, because these gangsters and these different gangs, and we've talked about this in the past, and I wrote about this in the previous edition, which you can see the previous edition. If you go to the site and you go up to little 3 lines, right, you go there, you can open the previous edition and read that too. But these different cocaine gangs across Europe, unbelievably bloody, and but quite secretive and quite tight with each other. Now, it's not just Europe. The Sky ECC encryption system was allegedly being used in Mexico, being used, by Colombian gangs, South American gangs, etc. We're going to focus on Europe. Now, what is interesting is that, yeah, it does look like kind of the underworld really clued in on this. And this is a crazy stat. And actually, this is just from Wikipedia, but it made me laugh. So I'm going to read this to you. That when they took a look at the actual users, you had 171,000 Sky ECC devices that were registered primarily in Europe, North America, several Central American, South American countries, okay, and some in the Middle East. A quarter of those, the active users, a quarter of them, they were in Belgium, 6,000, and the Netherlands, there were 12,000. Okay, now we talked about Brussels, Antwerp, we talked about the cocaine trade, Tito and Dino, the different groups that I mentioned. Obviously, the Cavaches, the Scaljaris, they also would bounce things around from Spain to Brussels, whatever. But what is actually interesting is that half of those users that I just mentioned were said to be located around one port of Antwerp, right? So you can imagine that the authorities have kind of clued in on those. Now, what has happened? Because there are so many messages and they're so blatantly open, that now it's kind of like going back in hindsight. The authorities are reading these and they're busting people all over, which this Brazilian bust with the son of Goran, kind of the Group America, that's linked supposedly back to Dark OS. But it's not just that. If you go and look in the first edition, the first edition and this edition of the Corners, and I talk a lot about the cocaine trade, pretty sure that a lot of those busts are going back to this one big encryption breakthrough, which leads us to admissibility and to the whole question of privacy. Because remember, when I mentioned the CEO who tried to defend himself, although it looks like, for example, the US FBI did not agree, he said, look, people should have the right to have privacy without just being automatically snooped by the authorities. Now, what you have is a situation where there are many trials, especially in Serbia, but these are linked to Montenegro, these are linked to all kinds of things. There are many trials that are going back to actually whether or not this information is going to be admissible. Now, in Serbia, in the case of Dark OS, there's been a ruling that says, yes, we're going to allow this to be admissible. This also impacts other gangsters, potentially politicians. There's a whole slew of people that could wind up being dragged into this, and there's a lot that already are. But a real question is, and I spoke to a couple of lawyers down there who said, look, okay, you've got a ruling by the court that says this is admissible. And I mentioned this in the magazine. That doesn't mean that you're not going to have appeals later that's going to bring this up. And why is this actually a question? Well, let's go back to how courts traditionally decided whether or not you could issue a warrant for surveillance. Well, what you had to do, and this was in the state, have you ever seen that show, The Wire? You remember the HBO shows, probably maybe watched it during COVID or before COVID, whatever. It was actually pre-COVID, but a lot of people watched it back then. And the whole first few shows, the first few seasons were based on these detectives in Baltimore trying to get enough information to go to a judge, to get the judge to give them a warrant, to allow them to basically put a wire on a telephone or wear a wire, put a wire on a telephone, put a bug on a telephone or wear a wire to record without the knowledge of these drug dealers, these gangsters, to try to get evidence. And the way that was usually based was, okay, we see what they're doing, here are the consequences of what we're doing, but they're very secretive and there's no other way for us to actually get enough evidence to move forward in this, but we can't allow this to go on because they're committing gross crimes that basically will destroy people's lives and maybe they're murdering people, whatever. That was kind of the basis of how that worked because the right to privacy was very, very valued. Now, these days, they probably couldn't even make that show now. Like if you wanted to start The Wire 2023 because you'd be like, well, okay, we're tapping you anyway. That's kind of what it seems like. Now, in Central Europe, it was not that different. And I'll give you an example. In Poland, the way it used to work was the same thing. The cops had to basically start working on a case and then basically make an argument to the judge, and the prosecutor would take it to the judge and say, look, we see it, we know what's happening, we can't get the evidence unless we take this next step, which will actually bring us the evidence that we need, but it's based on the fact that there's not another way to do it without getting a court decision to basically break your rights, your automatic rights to privacy. Now, the Sky ECC bust, and I'm not going to sit here and say that it's not a good thing that it was busted or that it was shut down. I'm not going to argue whether or not the CEO should go to jail or not, because he's got lawyers and he may be able to argue that he just created a system and they misused it and whatever, but not my problem. But I'm not unhappy it was shut down, because clearly it was helping the entire narco trade, which is like gone through the roof in Central Europe. And these guys are communicating everything, and you shouldn't really have a system that you can torture somebody and cut off his arms or throw him, burn him with acid and send it to your other gangster buddies and have a laugh over it. That's really how blatant it was. However, there's a big question when it comes in, and this is, is this going to hold up or not? Very hard to say whether all of these messages and all this evidence that they're going back to grab in hindsight should be allowed in court, because you're kind of skipping this long tradition of saying, look, we're working on this, we can't get the evidence. Now it's sort of like, hey, we already got it. Can we just go ahead and use it? And that is the question. We will see what will happen there. But in the meantime, there are a lot of busts. In fact, the first edition that I wrote of this, when I was talking about these just endless flood of cocaine coming here, and the gangs and the violence, I didn't anticipate, even when I wrote that there were going to be so many of these gangsters tied up in this that were going to go down, because tons of them are going down. That's not really going to change the picture, in the sense that, well, it will in the short term, it always does. But the last that I checked, and I was talking to some of my friends in the cops, and they're talking about the price of cocaine, for example, in Poland and Central Europe, it hasn't really gone up. A lot of these guys are getting busted, but the way mafias work, they're so kind of amoebic, and different small groups work with each other, that at least for the moment, it's still coming. And we may see some more violence and shakeups, especially in Antwerp and up in Holland, Belgium, and not only. But that's the thing. That is kind of the thing. Now, to finally finish off that thought, what happened, for example, in Poland, is they also streamlined this system a few years back under the Law and Justice government, who wanted to move things forward quicker. And this is where things get debatable. You start messing with tradition, and sometimes maybe you're infringing on other people's rights. Because instead of having to do the hard work, do the lead work, and then say, look, man, we can't get anywhere, make the argument, give it to the judge makes the decision, then you start doing surveillance. Maybe as the police, you start bugging someone, because we can't, private detectives, you can't put bugs around, just so you guys know. Instead, what they did is they create a system where the police could actually create a file, and they would do the surveillance, and then they would take it to the court and show them the list, and what they decide to go forward with, they would give it to the judge, and the rest of the stuff they throw away. So nobody really knows if they did it or not. You can see there is room for abuse there. That's all I'm going to say. That's all I'm going to say. But when we get into trying to prosecute criminals, and the way the world is getting more and more complicated and complex, it creates conundrums. So that's something to think about, at least the first thing. Now let's get on to the second thing, which is also focused on criminality, and that is extradition. That's going to be a short one, but this one kind of pisses me off. Now the second thing, extradition and Central Europe. Not only Central Europe, but hey, that's where I'm living. I did say we're coming from Warsaw, right? Did I say that? Warsaw, Poland? Did I say that, Evgeny?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I did. At least somebody knows. Somebody's out there. I can't actually see Evgeny or anyone else because it's dark. we could have a full studio audience and I wouldn't even know. Well, I'd probably know, but I wouldn't see him. Now, let's talk about extradition. The reason I want to talk about this is because on November 3rd, a story came up on the OCCRP website, the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project website, which is a great website and a great project. I really admire those guys. They're doing great work, so I always want to put a plug in for them. I don't know if they like me, but I always do. You know, I'm kind of a fan. But there's a story that came out, and this story kind of pissed me off. Not because they wrote it. I'm just what happened that pissed me off. Cyprus's, this is the first line. Cyprus's Supreme Court overturned a decision to extradite mining magnate Benny S. I'm just going to leave it like that. Benny S. to Romania on Friday, ruling that he faced a risk of inhumane treatment if sent to jail there to serve a 5-year sentence in a corruption case. Now, he was actually convicted of being involved in an organized criminal group that was getting a hold of formerly what were called royal lands worth $100 million. He was basically bribing people. And he's been a wanted man in Romania for a long time. Romania put him on the fugitive list, and there's a Europol wanted red note out there for him, and they caught him. And he was in Cyprus, and so Romania's been trying to extradite him, and now Cyprus said no. And one of the things that he said, he basically said that he was really happy that they refused to extradite him, and he's looking, I'm very happy that I'll finally be able to return back to my country during such a crucial time for Israel, because he is Israeli. Okay, no extradition for Benny. Now, why did this kind of piss me off? To tell you the truth, I'm real big on one thing. If you commit the crime and you get caught, you do the time. And that means in the country where you get caught. Now, yes, I do agree. There are some countries you don't want to send people back to those countries, but they're really not in the EU. Sorry, this is pretty BS here, to tell you the truth. You don't want to send somebody to, say, a country that's in the third world, that's got dictators, they got a history of torturing people, blah, blah, blah. I get it, because sometimes the guys that steal money, they're guilty of corruption, they got on the wrong side of some dictator back there, whatever. Bad things will happen to them, like drills and electric prongs to private parts and all that kind of stuff. That is not Romania. I don't care what anybody says, that's not Romania. Tons of guys go to jail in Romania. Tons of people have been in jail in Romania. I don't think that jail in Romania is pleasant. I don't think that jail in the US is pleasant. I don't think jail in anywhere is pleasant. But this kind of thing happens all the time. And so, but let's talk a tiny bit about how crazy it gets and how it seems that the rich white-collar guys, including the mafia types, never get extradited, and why. Now, I'm going to give you a quick example. I told you I was going to tell you some true stories today. I was the journalist years and years ago. I worked with a guy named Eric Ellis, and we found a guy named Abraham Goldberg, who at the time was kind of Australia's #1 white-collar criminal, in the sense that he was wanted, they said in the beginning for 19 counts, then they changed it to 21 counts of diverting, stealing a huge amount of money. Depending on how you counted it, it got up to 1.5 billion Aussie dollars. Now, his secretary basically went to jail. He kind of, in my opinion, he kind of set her up. And she went to jail for a while. They decided she was innocent, but he disappeared. And for 10 years, nobody knew where he was, which I have to admit I found kind of hard to believe, but I didn't give it much thought until Eric Ellis showed up in Poland, and somebody put him in contact with me, and he says, hey, I don't have much time. Do you think you can help me find this guy or try to find this guy? And I said, well, I guess so. I can try to find him. I had never given the guy any thought. Well, he was using a different last name at the time, Cadix, and we ended up finding him, tracking him down. We saw that he took a ton of his money and put it into real estate in this region. But in the end, we even went and interviewed him, and he was kind of hilarious, to tell the truth. We interviewed him, and he even told us, he said, hey, next time bring the TV crew along with you, because you'll be up for more awards as an investigator, you know, print's kind of going out of style and you're not, you know, that's actually the way he talked. Kind of a funny guy. I found him really highly amusing, which did not change anything when it came down to the fact that he was wanted on 21 counts of various, basically it was embezzlement, right? Now, he's passed away. Okay, he's passed away. I don't personally have anything against him, but I'm just going to tell you what happened. Well, nothing happened. For years, I had people come up to me and say, so that guy, remember that Australian guy, and you interviewed him, and he said that his biggest regret is he couldn't go back to Australia and eat in his favorite steakhouse, and he did say that. He said, well, what happened to him? Did he go to prison? I'm like, no, he didn't go to prison. In fact, we were a little bit befuddled ourselves because this was a huge deal in Australia. We were nominated for a Walkley Award, which is like the version of the Australian Pulitzer Prize. We didn't win. Oh well, came in second, which doesn't really matter, I guess. Horseshoes, hand grenades, whatever. But nothing happened. So this kind of bugged me. And I remember trying to ask cops, prosecutors, whatever. Finally, just because people were also nagging me, I filed at the time, this is years and years ago, I filed, you know, a letter. I said, well, what's happening? What happened? And I got the answer back in kind of a roundabout way. And the answer is literally from the Polish authorities. They were basically saying, look, hey, dude, don't blame us. We don't disbelieve you. We don't, you know, yeah, it could be true, whatever, but we don't have anyone filing that he committed a crime in Poland. I go, well, hold on a minute. What about the Australians? They aren't trying to extradite him? I mean, that's where the Interpol notice came from. It came from Australia. They didn't receive, at least back then, and this was a few years after we wrote the article, they just had never received a single letter from Australia trying to get any kind of extradition process moving. None. Well, later when when I talked to Eric about it, Eric said, look, if you're actually going to move $1.5 billion out of one country to another country, you probably had a little bit of help. Maybe there wasn't too many people that actually wanted this can of worms opened up. I don't know, but it brings us to one other that is a very simple statement that is much more complicated than it sounds, and that is if you want to extradite somebody, it is a process. The authorities, these are always international cases. They're usually involving serious crimes or big money, although they can be something even that goes back to even like a really nasty divorce. But most of the time, we're talking serious crime, big money, a lot of paperwork, and it's just, I've said this before, you hit prosecutors with that. They've got to deal with complex economic cases. They've got to deal with the law on the other side of whatever pond it is. They've got to get into translation issues. They get into, I dealt with a different case where it was kickback from Jersey, and I remember because they just didn't, the authorities just did not follow the proper procedure. They sent the forms, but they didn't send the right forms, and so it kept getting kicked back. Finally, it did go through, and then Jersey sent just tomes and tomes of information, probably more than they wanted. Once you get the information and it comes back, then you got to pay to have it translated. These type things take years, and then you have the lawyers in that other country, right, working for the guy that probably has a lot of money because maybe he stole it. That's why they're chasing him. And they're putting up all kinds of arguments and barriers to try to keep him from being extradited. Now, again, I do see the point when you're talking about extraditing somebody to, say, a country that might be literally, it's not, democratic. There are human rights issues all the time, etc. And every jail is unpleasant. And you could probably go to any jail in the world and say that there's like a human rights. I was in a jail in Oklahoma. I wasn't in jail, but I was a journalist in a jail in Oklahoma, and it was a little jail, kind of like Cooterville type. And I remember a prisoner reached through the bars, you could do that back then, tugged on my shirt. I said, what's going on? He goes, man, you gotta help me. Gotta help me. I'm getting scurvy. What? They're not giving me any oranges or anything. I need vitamin C. And I remember turning to the sheriff. I was a young journalist, and I said, hey, this guy, he says he's not getting any oranges and he's getting scurvy. I mean, he's got rights. The guy told me to my face, you find out in jail in Oklahoma, you don't got a lot of rights. That was back then. That was in Oklahoma. So we're not going to argue that, I'm not going to say jail in Romania is pleasant, but I will say that if you commit the crime in that country, you probably have a fairly good idea of what the consequences are in that country. And if that country is actually a democratic type of country, more or less, then yeah, I don't really see why where these arguments, how they hold water. But they do again and again. And I'll give you one final example before we go on to the third thing, and that is Spain. Now, Spain is not a bad example in the sense that when you take a look at, say, the Polish, the Central Bureau of Investigation, or the CBSP, and the Shadow Hunter group there, they're constantly finding guys and getting them extradited back to Poland. But a lot of them from Spain. They're making a lot of drug busts, pulling out. The Spanish have been known to be quite tough, and they're willing to work with foreign countries, especially in the EU, and extradite criminals from Spain to those countries again and again. But we've even seen where Spain had a very difficult time, and I'm going to talk about this on one of the other shows, where we had back, this probably would have been, I'm actually going to check, I don't want to lie to you, this probably was also around 2011 or so, when Spain suddenly, you guys may remember this, because it grew to be a bigger and bigger deal through all the way into, say, 2017, 2019, right before COVID. And forgive me, it looks like I don't have the details, woefully underprepared. I can't believe it. No, 2015, I am. Actually 2007, maybe even going back to there, but 2007, 2015, somewhere in that region. But no, it's actually 2007. The Spanish started to arrest Russian alleged mafia figures in Spain, mainly from the Tambovskaya and the Malishevskaya mafias, which is kind of a crazy thing anyway, because the head of the Malishevskaya mafia, the Malishevs and the Tambovs, they went to war in Petersburg, shot each other up, and then they started to be friends, or one of the former leaders went to Spain and started hanging out with the Tambovs. But the Spanish didn't like what they were seeing, and there were many, many allegations ranging from tax evasion to money laundering to ties to drug trafficking to prostitution, et cetera, et cetera. This was not just located in Spain, which is kind of what a lot of people think. That this also was linked to Parix Bank, which was up in Latvia, one of the first big Latvian banks that went down hard under allegations of money laundering. There was like €1 billion that supposedly went through Bulgaria. There was evidence all over the place, and the Spanish arrested about 20 guys. And then they started pointing fingers even at members of the Russian Duma and saying that there were links to Russian politicians that were very high up, maybe going all the way up to the guy at the top in Russia. And then what happened? That whole thing basically fell apart, but it started falling apart piece by piece. And part of these pieces that fell apart did come down to everything from granting people bail to extradition requests. I mean, one of the key guys, the Tambovs, head of the Tambovs, or one of the top guys in the Tambovs, Gennady P. They let him out of jail and said, "You come back for your trial." Well, he didn't show up again, right? But in the end, this all fell apart. So even the Spanish have a hard time with it. And 17 guys that everybody thought were going to do hard time, well, they were all exonerated in court, okay? Now, I'm going to do a show on that whole crazy case, because it also goes back to Litvinenko. Remember the guy that was radiation poisoning, he died. He was a witness in it. But even the Spanish, who are probably the best at this in the EU, have a terrible time with it. And honestly, what we ought to, if I were king, I would say, hey, you do the crime in that country. You can't try to make a claim not to be extradited to it later because you took off to a different country in the EU. I mean, that's really, they're all in the EU. That's just part of the game. But for now, Cyprus thinks that Romania is too tough. But on to the third thing, which is the Ukrainian war report. Now for the third thing. I started to say the third thing. Now for the third thing, which isn't funny. This is the Ukrainian war update. And as I said at the beginning of the show, Ukraine has had a hard time. The president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, has had a difficult time. It hasn't been a good 2 weeks. One of the reasons is Israel and Hamas. And basically, Ukrainians are coming right out and saying, look, no one's paying attention to what's happening with us, and we need money for weapons. And I was talking to a friend of mine before we get into the facts and some of the events, and I said, well, how's it going? He said, literally, he said, look, they need ammunition, they need air defense, there's so many things they need right now. This is really a frightening time in Ukraine, and it's a worrying time for soldiers at the front, but also because Russia is again just pounding civilian infrastructure, and it just is kind of disappeared from the news, which is upsetting. I find it upsetting. But let's talk about some of the things that have happened. Now, if you take a look at the corners, which is on this side or this side, wherever Evgeny puts it, in the new magazine, which you can read online, I do a summary of the Ukrainian war up to now and what the outlook is and what's been happening there, and you can read that. But there have even been some events that have happened since that came out that we're going to add to here. But just to bring a few things up, one of the things I did mention in the magazine was in the midsummer there was all these publications, newspapers, everybody saying that Ukraine is going to have a big breakthrough. The counteroffensive is going to be successful. Then this started getting wound down a little bit. If they can just take Tokmak, that was one of the goals. There's the interpretations that Zelenskyy said, if we take 3 cities, it's a big success. Things started slowing down. As you know, I always had my doubts whenever you talk about any kind of offensive, counteroffensive or normal offensive in modern day war. You know, you think 3-to-1 advantage on the ground, air cover. It's the first thing you think. We know that, and then also, you know, surprise. Ukraine didn't have any of that. It's amazing how much they have done, and specifically I'm speaking to what's been happening on the front in Zaporizhia, Robotnia, also some successes in Bakhmut, but we will talk about that when we go through what's actually happening on the ground. But now, when you had this wave of headlines back then they were so optimistic, although not everywhere. Like the Irish Times wasn't that optimistic. They were saying maybe it's time to negotiate. Now suddenly we're having basically the henpecking party where there are tons of headlines that are worrying and kind of coming down on Ukraine. And I'm not blasting the journalists here. I'm really not. I'm just saying that, okay, there's one headline, Radio Free Europe, Ukraine's counteroffensive isn't going as well as had been hoped. The prognosis isn't that great either. They're running out of time. Ukraine's counteroffensive is gaining urgency as winter approaches because you're worried about, you know, the winter and the mud. Then you've got concerns that Ukraine is running out of time and the U.S. is pressing for peace talks with Russia, you know, on and on. Now, this kind of culminated in a couple of ways. There was a report that came out, and you can also see it behind my shoulder, that suddenly Ukraine's top general, Valery Zaluzhny, he came out and he said he called the war a stalemate. Okay, he called it a stalemate. That has prompted many, many different reactions. Now, first of all, it sort of said, well, hold on a minute, you know, stalemate, ugh, it's probably not what the Biden administration was looking to hear. We'll talk about that in a minute when we come to support and money for Ukraine. But he kind of said what many of us were already saying. I'm talking about the vloggers and the bloggers, et cetera, that you've got this long, wide front. And if you take a look at the actual amount of land that changed hands since the beginning of 2023, and the New York Times wrote an article about this, it's actually Russia has gained more than Ukraine. And the gains, though, it's like the size of New York City. And if you just went along the board, you almost from a distance, if you zoom out of a map, you almost can't see anything. You can't see that either side made a lot of progress. Now, when he came out and said this, though, this was a far cry from what we had been hearing from just in general the Ukraine General Staff, from the Ukrainian government, from Zelenskyy, who was no negotiations. Yes, we are going to be successful. And there have been some who have said, you know what, maybe this was kind of like, that Zelenskyy had Zaluzhny say this in order to sort of test the waters and see what the reaction is, not only globally, but at home. I'm not exactly sure I believe that because Zelenskyy, he did come out and he basically said, no, it's not a stalemate. And he said, no, we're not going to negotiate. And then actually something else happened, which might have surprised a lot of people. That something else is that that supposedly at a request of the Ministry of Defense, who sent a letter supposedly to Zelenskyy, they dismissed the Major General from the post of the commander. This is actually coming from the office of the President of Ukraine. So they dismissed the Major General from the post of the commander of the Special Operations Forces at the request of Defense Minister Rustem Umerov. Now, then they basically published the statement and cited the law of Ukraine, which said that this is the way it works, that the president dismisses this military officer based on a request. But okay, that's a little bit passing the buck a little bit, but they do say that's what how the way the law works. And it says that Zelenskyy, by his decree dated November 3rd, dismissed Viktor Korenko and appointed Serhiy Lupanchuk as the new commander of the Special Operation Forces of Ukraine. And he said that Zelenskyy said he will continue to carry out operations. But what is interesting is that Korenko said he doesn't know why he was dismissed, and that Zaluzhny did not submit a request for him to be dismissed. And there have been, articles and blog postings that have basically come out and said the Americans don't know why. They liked working with him. They thought he was doing a pretty good job. And when we go back and we talk about some of the things that some of these raids and some of these almost impossible things that the Ukrainian special forces have done, and I don't know how much say he had when it came into, say, like the Navy drone strikes and some of their successes, sinking ships, hitting Sevastopol. Some of these type things, I don't know if that would have fallen under him or not. Maybe I should know that, but I don't know that. But when you see that actually this didn't come from Zelenskyy's top military general, well, there is going to be talk, is there a rift? And there is open talk, is there a rift? But then there's talk that no, there's not a rift. I'm kind of thinking there might be a rift, but who knows? Something to think about. What we do know, however, is that times are getting tough, and especially this is coming down to money. Now, the U.S. is not making a secret about openly saying through, anonymous officials that they're worried that Ukraine does not have the manpower, and it seems like Russia just has endless manpower. And even there have been stories that have shown up that have said even if Ukraine gets more weapons and gets them faster, because this has been one of the big problems, that they don't have the manpower to use them, and that their top brass in the field, still some of those guys are a little bit old-fashioned. They don't even know how to use some of this stuff and put it to the best use. Maybe all of that is a little bit true. But there is kind of worse news, and the worst news is this, is that once the Israeli-Gaza conflict erupted, the attention of the U.S. Did refocus. Now, if we go back to, say, early October or mid-October, it's true that President Biden in the U.S. administration sort of anticipated the Republican resistance. He started talking about $105 billion of aid that would be combined, he wanted to sort of combine this to get it to Ukraine. That was not going to fly. Now what we've seen is that the Republicans and the Democrats are calling this a poison pill. The Republicans basically said, hey, we're willing to put through $14.5 billion to Israel, but this is tied to a reduction in expenditure when it comes to the IRS. And also the Republicans, as always, are quite unhappy with the situation on the border. While the Biden administration is trying to fight this or come up with a different plan that would send a combined Ukrainian aid with money that will be used for the border to try to make the Republicans happy, the Republicans aren't buying it. What this all means, basically, is that, yeah, Ukraine is under a lot of pressure. And again, as I mentioned before, it doesn't seem like Russia is wearing out, tiring out, and they seem to have endless guys that they'll just throw into the fight, whether or not they are well-armed, well-trained, or have any arms at all. We're going to talk about that when we talk about Avdiivka in a minute. Very difficult times, and I have to say my opinion, since you've been listening to my opinion this whole time, is that, man, I just can't, I don't get the Republicans now. Now, I'm hardly a Democrat. I'm like one of the middle-of-the-road guys. But I'm from the time when the Republicans were Ronald Reagan. Remember, evil empire, saying, you know, we cannot let this happen. For me, this whole twist in this, and when you read that Putin is hoping that Trump or another Republican will win the next election to become president because he sees them far more positively than the Democrats. This just kind of, it just sort of rocks my world. I think there's a lot of Republicans out there that are kind of mystified. They're sort of shocked at how this has all changed. What I don't think, I think we might have to be realistic. Ukrainians might have to be realistic. Zelenskyy might be forced into a different type of deal than he wants if the money's going to stop coming from the U.S., etc. But that doesn't mean that if there's a deal made, whatever that deal is, that doesn't mean that this is over. And if you look at what the Russian bloggers are saying, and this is something that the U.S. Republicans should keep in mind, the Russian bloggers, the ones that are pro-Russian, and we have to look at these, you know, we're just even trying to follow what's happening on the front, because both sides are pretty secretive, right? They're saying, look, no one's saying that the Russians are going to, they don't want to negotiate, because now they feel like they're sort of winning. They've gotten things going the way they want to. How they did it might be despicable. If you're going to suddenly welcome Hamas and you're going to deal with Iran and you're going to bomb civilian infrastructure and you're going to plan on freezing the Ukrainians, that this is horrible. But it's difficult to negotiate with the side that suddenly feels like they're winning. The Republicans in the U.S. need to think about this and think about where this is going, because I don't think this is going to end. Even if you negotiate a deal right now, who's to say what's going to happen in just a few years? Who's to say what's going to happen a few years from now, right? So anyway, enough of that, enough lecturing. Let's get on to what is happening on the ground. I'm going to keep it short and sweet because, to tell you the truth, there is not a ton happening on the ground, certainly not a lot of positives, but let's go to the maps. Now, if you take a look at this first map, I'm just showing it the way I always do, to show the entire front, all the way from Kherson, going all the way up Zaporizhzhia, all the way up to Bakhmut, all the way up to Svatovo, up to Kupiansk, and then you keep going up to Sumy, whatever, to Kharkiv. Now, what we're going to do is we're just going to talk briefly, mostly about what is happening in Kherson and what is happening, a little bit about Zaporizhzhia, but also what is happening in Avdiivka and a bit about Kupiansk. And so you're probably saying now, hey, you're going to talk about everything you always do. No, I'm really not. What we're going to talk about, though, is Kherson. Now, we're going to zoom in on just one part of Kherson. Actually, I'll show you one other quick map. This is Kherson. You can see what it looks like. You see the big picture. But if you take a look closely, now I'm going to come in. There are a couple of spots that we've talked about in the past. And we did talk about Kozachi Laheri, but there's also Pishanivka, but there's Krinky. Now, what is happening at Krinky? Well, what is happening is that Ukrainian, and we assume these are special forces, have been for the last 10 days even just pushing across these islands and across the river and trying to get a bridgehead on the other side of the Dnipro. of the Dnieper River, and they have done it at least for now. Now we saw this before back at Kozachi where they did something like this, but then the Russians honed in and they hit them with drones, artillery, and we don't know what happened to those guys, but they lost that bridgehead. Hopefully they managed to escape, no idea. This is a little bit different, and you can see why. Now take a look at this first map. And you can see Krinky, and actually, and this is why I'm going to show you a second map so you get a better idea of it. But you see the Dnieper, and then you see these kind of little islands and just bog and all that kind of stuff. And then you see this arrow, that's the Russians counterattacking, trying to keep these Ukrainians from forming much of a bridgehead. But if you take a look at the topographical map, you see that Krinky is actually like all this long strip that goes along the part of the river where you could still like put a little house or whatever and you wouldn't like sink into the bog. Now, this is a little bit different than say what we saw at Kozachi because the Ukrainians can infiltrate into this area and they can be spread out, and it's not something where they're quite as susceptible to just getting to having concentrations of men bombed and killed. The other goal, which was made evident by a couple of the blogs, is that if they get across out of this strip and they get into the forested areas beyond Krinky, it's going to be very difficult to get them out of there. Now, here's the question. If they do this, is this going to be enough to change the war? Because one of the goals has been to get guys into Kherson, because you don't have the fortifications and the trench lines down that way so you have at Zaporizhzhia. Good question. Good question. Maybe it could, but then there's a bigger question whether or not the Ukrainians are actually going to mount much of a counteroffensive now, because it seems as if the counteroffensive all across the fronts has slowed down to just about a stop. This is one area which I got to say, this is still interesting. I find it a little bit difficult that it's going to be feasible that they can get enough forces across there, but they may get enough across there to just sort of help them pose a threat to what the Russians are trying to do to combat in a little bit further to the east, slightly to the northeast, I guess, in Zaporizhzhia at Orkiv, at Robotyne. Now let's jump to that, and you see, here's the map, you see Orkiv, but if you go closer, yes, what do we have? We have Robotyne. I think I said Robotyne. I say that sometimes, but really it's like Robotyne. Now, take a look at this first map, you see the trench lines. We've talked about that before. In the general, we thought that there might end up being a mechanized breakthrough going towards Verbove, which is to the east of Robotyne, and then they could angle back down towards Peshtinya in the direction of Tokmak, which I think you can see is going to be down on the bottom, the bottom left-hand side of the screen. All that we hoped, we thought maybe that was going to get somewhere, but it hasn't until this day. We know that there have been some efforts to try to go straight down from Robotyne to Novoprokopivka. There's nothing new there. We know that the Ukrainians were also pushing to try to widen their hold on this salient towards Kopani. Now what we're primarily hearing is that the Russians are pushing back, and they're pushing back hard. And when I say pushing back hard, if we go to this next map, which is basically the topographical map, you can see the diamonds that are the different Russian forces. I didn't bother labeling them, but if you just use those as kind of a direction finder for you. To the west of Robotyne, you've got a concentration of Russian forces, and we know that they're pushing back hard in that direction. We know that they bolstered their forces south of or in Novoprokopivka, but also they are pushing hard apparently out of Verbove. And what we're actually hearing are not that there are Ukrainian counteroffensive going, but we're hearing that the Russians are pushing back and trying to get gains or to regain lost territory and lost trenches. Although we do know that once the Ukrainians sort of they manage to grab a little land and they hunker down, it's hard to get them out of there. Now, the next map. You'll see this next map, and I'm just showing you, we're going to kind of skip through these, but you've seen Huliopole, Velika Novosilka, Vuhledar, Velika Novosilka, that's where we talked about Staromayorsky many times. I'm not going to say much about that, except that we do know that the Russians are counterattacking on a small scale there. Doesn't look like the Ukrainians are doing anything there. In fact, if we slide all the way up, and we go up this map all the way up to you see to Makhivka, to these lines, all we're hearing is that it's actually Russian attacks. That's Vuhledar, Marinka, all the way up there to, yes, Avdiivka. Now let's go to Avdiivka and talk about that. Avdiivka has just become brutal. The types, the kinds of the fighting, the level of fighting, the kind of fighting, and the casualties there, well, we're hearing all kinds of stories. Now, these have ranged. We heard a week or 10 days ago that they believe that the Russians had lost 4,500 troops there. They lost 100-something tanks or vehicles. We keep getting different stories. And then that went up to 6,500 troops, 200 vehicles. Then we heard that they lost 25 tanks in one day. It's very hard to get a handle on what are the real numbers, except it is believable that, yes, the Russians have lost a lot, but they just keep doubling down. And this is where you're hearing the stories of Russians literally forcing convicts to go in there, just carrying equipment. They don't even have a gun, okay? You carry the equipment forward, and if you get shot, well, oh well, it's tough to be a convict that signs up for war, but try to find yourself a weapon and keep fighting. And then the more experienced troops, kind of like what the Wagners used to do, they would say, you go in there, and then they would use those troops, this cannon fodder, to find weak spots. This is the story that we keep hearing out of it. We also are hearing that now there are battles taking place in the tunnels under Avdiivka. It's getting to be very, very World War I. If we do a close-up, now you can see, actually before we do a close-up, you take a look at this map, look at those Russian arrows. You've got this kind of Avdiivka salient, right? And then you've got this pincer, and you see all those arrows down slightly north of Nevelsky, south and north of Pervomaisky, Severny, Vodnyane. You see that the Russians are pushing hard in the south, and they're pushing hard in the north, but they're also pushing hard apparently all around Avdiivka. This is a real bloody focus, and they're actually supposedly pushing even in Krasnohorivka, north of that kind of pincer up where you see Berdichi. Now, the Russians supposedly at one point they got into Berdichi, then they were pushed back out of Berdichi. But if we actually we show this Avdiivka map and we go back to the topographical map, and you see Avdiivka, and then you go up and you see at the very top, I hope this isn't cut off, you see Stepovi and Berdichi, but then you see this one arrow that is by this kind of blotch, and that's the Tarakhan mine tailings area that the Ukrainians held on to for a while, which gave the Ukrainians the heights and a bit of advantage. That apparently they've finally lost that now, just from being assaulted by these waves, endless waves of Russians. Now, the worry at Avdiivka is that, yes, the Ukrainians could lose it, and it would be difficult for them to pull out. There's going to be a time when they'll have to retreat from that, possibly. Big battle, and Russia is throwing everything into it. And the only good news that we're hearing from this, and if you take a look at this second map, which focuses a bit more on Stepove, Krasnohorivka, you can get a better look at that. It's still kind of the same thing, Vesela. The news from the Ukrainian side that's coming out that's being put across as good news is that, again, they are just draining the Russians when it comes down to losses in terms of manpower and vehicles. Whenever I see that, I get a little worried, though, that this is the PR machine trying to put a good spin on something that is quite ugly. I guess the upside is that as the weather gets worse and worse, everything is going to slow down. And so this stalemate, hopefully, if that's what it is, then hopefully that's how it stays, and we don't see something where suddenly the Russians have a breakthrough. Now, if we go north, I'm not going to talk much about this, because if we go north all the way to Bakhmut, in Bakhmut. We know that there was some good news not that long ago about the Ukrainians making progress in Adrivka and Klishevka. The Russians are actually trying to take that back. If you go all the way up to Bilohorivka, that story's been going on forever. There's not a lot that has changed. The only thing that's changed, and we go up to Kupiansk. I'm going to skip Svatove, although you can see a little bit of that front on this next map. But you see up there where Liman Pershi is, right, in Senkivka, okay, in Kupiansk. We've talked about that for the last 4 or 5 shows, how there were, the Russians massed a huge amount of troops there. There are some that think that the reason why the Russians have made progress at Avdiivka is because the Ukrainians had to pull troops away from that because they were dealing with such a huge force of Russians in Kupiansk and this push on Senkivka. They may be right. What this is kind of not showing, this map is not showing here, is that if you took it Liman Pershi, and you see those arrows which you've seen week after week, and you go follow that line where there's that kind of gray zone, and you see another Russian arrow at Pershotravneva, and then Orlyanka. Yeah, it actually, there should be, if you ask me, at Yahidne. We believe that the Russians are pushing all along this line, not just in one spot, because we tend to kind of look and think that it's actually just Liman Pershi for Senkivka. Now, if we take a close look at Senkivka, here's the topographical map. You can see Senkivka, and you can see this gray zone. That would indicate, and this is also what we're hearing, is that the Russians are right on the edge of that, and there are some, of course, these are the more pro-Russian bloggers that are saying Senkivka will soon be hit, even in a matter of days, and it will fall. That would be a big blow to the Ukrainians, and we have to hope that does not happen. So here's me face. I shouldn't keep saying that. I'm stealing from Aussie Man. I love that guy. He's hilarious. But here I am. That's the end of this episode of The Three Things. I hate to end it on a down note. I think that the stalemate is a reality. Who knows? Maybe the Ukrainians have something up their sleeve, but it looks like we're in for the bad weather is already coming and the winter's coming, and we're going to see what happens over the next few months through the end of the year. For my Ukrainian, I know there's a lot of Ukrainians watching. Hang in there. Some of us are very much with you. You're in our prayers. Hopefully the tide will turn again. But more than that, I hope that you're safe. I don't wish anyone to be hurt on any side. We need peace in the world, although it seems to be very far-fetched. Otherwise, over and out. See you soon. See you in a week. Have a read. I will post on the site some other stories, some follow-ups, because a lot of things are changing. We've had, the Polish elections, some of these events in Serbia that I mentioned. The world is becoming our region is becoming very, very fluid. And yeah, life is a risk. Otherwise, over and out. See you soon. Do widzenia. Cześć. Ahoy. Bye-bye. And till next week.